standing just for a minute and address a few words to a member of this congregation that would be here if she could, when her family is here. And I speak to you and through you to her. In a day when there are fewer and fewer veterans among us because of those who pass on, sometimes those who are still with us might wonder, why me? Why am I still here? And the answer is because God and the Holy Spirit willed you to be among us as living symbols of the sacrifice that we embody in Remembrance Day. That's why you're still with us. So to you and through you, Joyce, Lorna, thank you. Thank you. Please be seated. In the presence of the Spirit, may the true word move swiftly from the ear to the heart, and from the heart to the world around us all. Amen. There have been, and we need to remember that there continue to be, dark and foreboding times in the history of mankind. In these times, all those whose minds are filled with the weight of the matter become understandably troubled. And in the midst of troubles, it's a natural reaction for the human psyche to turn to worry. And that worry often becomes amplified to the point of anxiety, speculation, and enlargement of the problem. Sometimes that enlargement proceeds out of proportion to the concern, sparking doomsday or eschatological thoughts of the end time, a kind of Chicken Little thought that the sky is falling, the sky is falling. It's a psyche where all too often faith and reason, the human heart that is God-given, takes a back seat to fear and irrational thoughts. One of the readings for today, which we didn't read, but I'd just like to briefly outline for you, is a letter to the community of Thessalonica from Paul. And although not possibly authored by Paul, nevertheless it's solidly in his message. And it's offered to a community who have been confronted with escalating rumors of the second coming of Christ, of this end time when the affairs of man will come to an end in a violent upheaval that will serve to sort the wheat from the chaff, from those who are saved as opposed to those who are damned. Of course, those sort of rumors generate worry, and worry generates that psyche. It's a temptation to depart from a heart of faith and a heart of righteousness. Everyone begins to ask, vis-a-vis the saved, am I in or am I out? Which particular camp am I in? You can almost feel the pent-up hysteria that this letter is trying to address as folks begin to wonder what they can do to count among the saved. Voices of false leadership arise. Some shouting, run for cover. Some of them saying, head for the hills, and others untruthfully saying, follow me because I understand this whole end time thing. We only need to hearken back to the Jim Jones, Jonesville massacre and mass suicide of 1978 to realize the dangers of untruth in the middle of that kind of hysteria. So in today's passage, the Pauline letter offers a simple but profound message. The author wants to remind the community of Thessalonica of the truth that they know, the goodness of that truth, and the everlasting hope that is their inheritance in Christ. This passage wants to clarify some misconceptions about the return of Christ and the way in which they should wait for that return. They are to remain calm, confident, and faithful, grounded in the love of God and compassionate for each other as the only true posture for those who would be saved. The end time will come like a thief in the night, as it says elsewhere in Scripture, unpredictable, sudden, and cannot be presaged by any rumor. Paul is not the only authority here. We have Jesus to thank for the expectation of the second coming and its link with the end of the world as we have known it. For example, in chapter 13, Mark's Gospel, Jesus says, "There will be suffering such as has not been seen from the beginning of creation." There will be suffering such as has not been seen from the beginning of creation. 23 million in the First War. 52 million in the Second War. You can't count that number. If you had a number every half second, you can't count it in 10 years. And every one of those people, every one, could have been a Mozart, could have been a great contribution to mankind. Staggering loss. There will be suffering. Does that sound familiar? Doesn't that sound like the conduct of war? Is war not the scale of calamity that would bring us to the very brink of temptation to despair and lose sight of God's promise? That those who hold faith and righteous for his sake will prevail over any evil, no matter how monstrous that evil might be. It's that triumph of the human spirit that I feel called again to visit today. God-given qualities of honor, bravery, and that ultimate expression of love first exemplified in Jesus. A love so great as to sacrifice one's life for others. That's why we're here. That's what we're asked to remember today. I'd like to bring you into this thought by sharing two stories as illustrations of what God's love and love for one another can accomplish in the face of mortal danger and apparently impenetrable evil. Both stories are true. And like Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, both offer an opportunity to direct our attention to what God really calls us to do when confronted with the unnerving effects of evil and destruction. The first of these stories is about a Canadian pilot, Flight Officer Robert Edward Rennie, who flew Lancaster bombers under the command of the RAF as part of Bomber Command in the Second War. This story was told to me by Robert's brother, Don Rennie, Professor Don Rennie, just a few months before he passed away of cancer in 2002. I'd known Don for a long time. I'd known him for a decade, and he never once spoke of this story. But when he came to the last months of his life, it was time to tell it. He felt the need to share it. Flight Officer Robert Rennie and his crew were in a Lancaster bomber on November 6th, 1943, just about exactly 70 years ago. They were shot up. It was a time in the war when full fighter coverage all the way to Germany and back was rare, and they were badly shot up. Badly enough that they were losing power, they could not maintain altitude, and worse yet, they were electrically damaged and they could not jettison their bomb load. All they could do was to descend under reduced power and hope to break out of the low overcast that was underneath them and see what their options were. They couldn't know until they got there. So they descended, and they broke out of a very low overcast, just about 1,000 feet above the ground, to find themselves dead on course for the center marketplace of a small Dutch town of Zwolle. It was a Friday morning, and the marketplace was full of people trading what little provisions they had late in the middle of the war, and they were all gathered. There were hundreds of people in the marketplace. Those people that were in the marketplace looked up and saw the bomber approaching. And they told this tale later that for reasons only the pilot would know, under reduced power and a heavy load, remember he couldn't jettison his bombs, he suddenly and violently banked to the right to avoid the town. But in doing so, he stalled the aircraft and lost control. They hit the ground with a full bomb load, which detonated. And all 7 were instantly lost with the crew. We can't know what went through Pilot Officer Rennie's mind in that split second that he made a decision, knowingly, to cast aside his own life and that of his crew in favor of those that were in the marketplace ahead of him. He knew it. He had to have known it. But he made the decision. Some years later, the Thomas Muller phoned up Don Rennie. Don survived the war. He was actually 19 years old, flying submarine patrol out of Prestwick, Scotland at the time. They phoned him up 50 years after the event in 1993 and invited him and his whole family as guests of the village to come to the Netherlands to see something. So they went, and when they arrived, they found that the town had put up a memorial, a cairn, to the crew. Not in the cemetery, not outside of town, but right in the middle of the marketplace. And to Don's great delight and surprise, it wasn't just that the townspeople who were there, who were survived, knew the story. Every child who could speak and articulate it knew the story. Every child in the street. The second story I want to share with you is a story of an operation called Operation Manna. Actually, Operation Manna and Chowhound, because the Americans insisted that the name be changed when they lately entered the process. But Operation Manna occurred very, very late in the war, April 29th, just 9 days before the cessation of hostilities on May the 8th. It's a story of two Avro Lancasters that were chosen for a test flight, and this test flight was pushed by a small flight crew that asked their superiors, look, here it is late in the game, and yeah, we've all pretty much survived the war. But what we need to do, what we feel called to do, is to fill this bomber full of food. Because even that late in the war, there were pockets of German resistance in Western Holland, and people were starving. People in Rotterdam were eating tulip bulbs and anything else they could get their hands on. The crew of the first bomber to go out, actually the second one never got airborne, but the first one to go, the bomber was called Bad Penny, and I think it was a good luck thing because a bad penny always shows up. And showing up back at base was a really good thing, especially in Bomber Command where 60% of all crews were lost during the conduct of the war. Interestingly, this crew of 7 men, 5 of them were from Ontario. And the pilot, the flying officer, was Robert Upcott of Windsor, Ontario. So these 5, on their own, before an agreement with the Germans had been reached for a safe corridor to drop their load of food, took off anyway. And it was an appalling day. Several times they were down to 50 feet. A, to get over the German guns because the ceasefire hadn't been reached, and B, simply to get underneath the weather. So instead of filling their bomber with the usual bomb load of 14 to 18,000 pounds of bombs, they filled it full of food. And they made for Rotterdam, occasionally at 50 feet, dropped their load, and fed hundreds and hundreds of people. The epilogue to this story is actually all about Bill in a bar. And I'll connect the dots here in a second. As a graduate student in Belgium in the mid to late 1970s, me and an American friend went downtown to downtown Brussels, and as one tends to do in the afternoon, you slide into a cafe bar and sit down and have a beer. I think I was waiting for a train for Jane to arrive, actually, I think is what was happening. The guy who was with me, his name was Gaylord Ashmead, and Jane will attest that he was very American. He was loud, he was a graduate of the business school, Chicago Business School, and if you heard him speak in public, there was no question he was American. So we sat down to order a beer. And the waiter came up, oui monsieur, and I said to my best friends, je veux commander un shot, s'il vous plaît. And they said, oui monsieur, and he went away, and he came back, and he brought, not a shot by the way, it's just a draft beer, you know, suds that any student would drink. What he comes back with is a bottle of Bass Charrington. And Bass Charrington is a way of saying, eh, you Americans, in a roast beef, you know, English guys. Okay, it's a little bit of a slight. And I looked at it and I said, mais non, monsieur, excusez, mais j'ai commandé un shot as a Bass Charrington. And a little discussion started. And as this discussion got going, there suddenly stepped between me and the waiter a little guy, 5'4", in a blue beret and a wool peacoat down to his shins, And he glanced at me and turned to the waiter with his back to me, and for 60 seconds tore a strip out of the waiter. The gist of it I got, that if you had any brains, which you obviously don't, every time that you drive to work, you drive over the bones of this countryman, because you're too stupid to know that he's Canadian. Didn't say anything about my friend, fair enough. And when he was done, there was a pregnant pause, there was a tense silence, and the waiter turned, picked up the two bass, turned it, went away, and came back with two shrimp. And before he left, never knew who he was, the little man turned to me and in perfect English said, "I am so sorry you had to see that." What I was witness to that day was the echo of Robert Rennie. The echo of a God-given heart that at the expense of his own life saved hundreds of others. And that same God-given heart never forgets that. Never will. For all those who were alive that day, they will continue to hold that in their heart. So if you're a Canadian and you find yourself in the streets of any of the Benelux countries, you will be treated well. Not on our own merits. I was far too young. I'm born in the 50s. I had nothing to do with the war, and neither did my family. But what they're really doing is reflecting this heart of sacrifice. God's promise to us in this reading, this letter to the community of Thessalonica, is the same as our promise to them. Your faith in the face of triumph, or in the face of untruth, and your sacrifice as one of the righteous elect are not and will not be forgotten. Your love for all things good and righteous before God did triumph over all manner of evil. That's the way it was then. That's the way it is now. And God willing, that's the way it always will be.